Welcome to all of my listeners. We're here from the Academy of Social Sciences, Britain's premier, indeed only, organisation that speaks for all of us who count social science as our overwhelming discipline. So whether like me, you're an economic historian, whether you're an economist, whether you're a sociologist, a psychologist, whatever your background may be in social science widely defined, you are welcome here today. I have a great set of panelists who I will introduce in a moment, one by one, as they come up to speak. And we're here today to talk about whether increasing happiness and improving welfare can create economic growth. So it's the other way around to the way we usually think about it. We often think about how economic growth can increase happiness and improve welfare. Well-being, but we don't often think about it the other way around. So we've got a panel of four really interesting people who've thought about this in different contexts from different intellectual backgrounds for some time now. And it is a pleasure to welcome them and to welcome you to this event. I can tell you, for those of you who are attending, we've had all sorts of Zoom problems in the last 15 minutes. And I can tell you, we have caused Lara no end of negative well-being points and a few for us as well. But Lara, you are genuinely welcome here, notwithstanding all the problems. We promise we weren't picking on you. It really isn't that. So Lara, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here, and no worries about the Zoom. It makes me feel really good when it happens to someone else instead of when I'm running the event. I'm just going to share my screen. So I believe it's my role today to kick us off with some broader views on well-being across OECD countries over the past 15 years or so to frame the discussion. And I work at the OECD in Paris at the OECD Wellbeing Center, which is the premier part of the OECD that deals with all things beyond GDP. And I'm bringing to you some hopefully interesting reflections on the questions of today's event. I'll focus on two things: the relationship between well-being and economic growth, and then just some data points on how well-being more generally has developed. So which aspects of people's life have improved and which haven't. And then I'll give you an overview of which OECD countries have developed well-being initiatives with some illustrative examples of how these have impacted policy processes, focus on resource allocation and budgeting. I'll mainly draw on examples that are not covered by our other speakers. Great. So before we get started, very briefly, I do want to be clear on what I mean in this presentation when I refer to well-being. On this slide, you see the OECD Wellbeing Framework, which is how we conceptualize the outcomes that matter to people, planet, and future generations, which we use at the OECD to benchmark societal progress in our member countries. Many nationally developed well-being frameworks are very similar to this one. You might be very familiar, for instance, with the ONS's measures of national well-being. What I do want to highlight here is that this view of well-being is multidimensional and covers people's material conditions, so their income, their work and job quality, their housing conditions, and also their non-material quality of life and their relationships with others. So happiness and life satisfaction are part of this conceptualization under the subjective well-being dimension up on the top right, because we do think it's important to ask people themselves how they're doing in their lives, but it's not kind of a separate or some sort of overarching goal or dimension in our framework. When I say well-being, I mean all of these aspects of people's lives that matter for a good life, not only happiness. So, Tim, really, you've already said it very well. The event today asks if increasing well-being creates economic growth, and normally it's the other way around, right? Like the momentum for growing beyond GDP has come from asking whether economic growth also leads to improved lives. Actually, I'm not answering that question on this slide. We're not really seeing causality or directionality here. These are correlations between GDP growth and changes in well-being indicators that operationalize the well-being framework between 2010 and 2024. So we essentially just ask whether countries that grew faster economically over this period also improved more on well-being, or that have improved on well-being have also grown economically. And the answer, surprise, surprise, is that with a few exceptions, namely household income, employment rate, safety measured by the homicide rate tend to improve alongside economic growth. These are in blue here. Changes in almost all other well-being indicators don't have a significant correlation with GDP growth at this higher cross-country comparative level. And that obviously then makes for the well-known argument that you're missing many policy goals you should care about if you're only focusing on economic growth. And there's a clear trade-off that's on the right here in red between growth and greenhouse gas emissions or environmental outcomes. Of course, I do find this, I'll kind of get back at the end to which investments in people's well-being might, especially at the individual level, have also an economic payoff. But the overall kind of economic growth versus well-being argument is, of course, a little bit simplistic. What's perhaps also quite interesting is to see, even within multidimensional well-being, which aspects of well-being do move together, which often then underscores that, there's just inherent trade-offs in policy decision making. And on this side, we see for each OECD country, the number of indicators for material conditions, quality of life, and community relationships that have either meaningfully improved in green, shown no clear change in yellow, or deteriorated in red since 2010. And there's actually a very clear pattern. So the majority of OECD countries have actually improved in material conditions, which again, as a reminder, covers things like household income, employment, so the gender wage gap, housing conditions. But they have actually stagnated or even worsened in non-material aspects. So quality of life, for instance, includes things like life expectancy, mental health, student skills, air pollution, homicides, life satisfaction, etc. And overall, this is a pattern that holds across most countries. So I've also been kind of asked to comment on, have countries developed differently depending on whether they've introduced a well-being initiative or not? The answer is this pattern is pretty universal. And I mean, there's reasons for that. I'll get back to some of those later. So for quality of life, we see that only 2 OECD countries, I haven't highlighted them, but they're the ones with the largest green bars in the middle column. Estonia and Poland have consistently improved in more than half of their quality of life indicators since 2010. And the majority of countries in Europe and the Americas have made progress in only up to 2 headlines. Those are always quite different ones. And then the US is maybe interesting to highlight. That's at the bottom here. The outcomes and headline indicators for material conditions on the left have not worsened. Nothing here has deteriorated in material conditions relative to 2010, but they have deteriorated in 4 out of 9 quality of life headlines with available data. So homicide rate, death of despair, life expectancy, and the share of people experiencing more negative than positive feelings. To further highlight these somewhat concerning trends in non-material aspects of well-being, also over the shorter term. So now we're not looking since 2010, but since 2019, so just before pre-pandemic levels. You can see on this slide that compared to pre-pandemic levels, life satisfaction, feelings of pain, worry, sadness, and loneliness have all worsened in more OECD countries than have seen improvements. And again, those are consistent patterns across countries. There's not really one country where things have all improved in this. Sorry, I hope you can't see this. In this in those quality of life indicators. So in practice, implementing those kind of more balanced strategies that look at those trade-offs between economic and non-economic aspects of people's lives will require developing tools and processes to systematically reflect well-being evidence in policy decisions. And we have seen that actually a lot of OECD countries have put in place well-being initiatives over the past decade, namely around 2/3 of countries at this point. The ones shown on this slide are only national level ones. So we have even more examples at the subnational levels. Obviously, we hear from Wales and Scotland today, who are very much leading examples of well-being policy practice, and then those are only OECD countries. Um, so there's obviously also global examples, and we'll hear from Bhutan today too. So we've classified these initiatives into more measurement-focused ones and more policy-oriented frameworks. The former usually focused on publishing well-being data, usually situated in statistical offices, whereas the latter initiatives are often situated in policy ministries, centers of government, so the PM's office, Treasury, Ministry of Finance, and they have the at least more explicit aim to also reflect well-being evidence and principles in policy decisions and processes. If you are interested in just more details on any of those well-being initiatives, also including subnational examples, I invite you to visit the Knowledge Exchange platform on well-being metrics and policy practice website that we have built, which has dedicated case studies for each of these. I believe the slides might be shared with participants afterwards. Great. And it is, I will now say, it's quite difficult at this point to point to any single one of these initiatives and say, here everything works. The entire governmental machinery and economic systems have now been changed to focus on well-being, and that has led to a virtuous cycle. And now productivity is up too. That would be quite naive. Even where well-being policies have launched, they are often one of many policies. But what we do see emerging are good practices of which types of more operational processes and designs are promising and embodying well-being principles. And we see the evidence base, I think, is not quite there yet, but we see also in discussions with our countries really the demand to now link them back to questions of productivity, competitiveness, etc. So I think a lot more research will be coming out on this going forward. I'll just very briefly show you what, or we'll close off with some quick illustrative examples of the different ways of how OECD countries are using well-being evidence and well-being principles in budgetary processes. Budgetary process is not the only, part of the policy cycle where well-being evidence can be used, but it's obviously quite interesting because it's a real lever for policy change, and where identification of trade-offs is especially useful and important. First, by acknowledging and handling multidimensionality and complexity, well-being objectives by definition tend to cross across departments and silos and expenditure lines. And here we see, for instance, New Zealand's first well-being budget was incentivizing the departments that submitted budget bids for joint bids across departments. In Ireland, we've seen an extensive budget tagging exercise in which cross-departmental expenditure lines for both current and capital expenditure were mapped to the dimensions of Ireland's well-being framework. The second well-being policy principle we see is the need to not only understand whether life is getting better or not, but for whom. So distributional aspects of policy decisions. And here, Canada is a very interesting example. Since 2021, their quality of life framework has been integrated into the federal government budget process via budget impacts report that report publicly on the quality of life impacts of initiatives. The template kind of requires the different departments to specify expected impacts on quality of life outcomes, and also on different population groups in an intersectional way. Third, we know that incorporating participatory elements can help ground the budget in lived experience and also create accountability mechanisms whenever you want to, include the legislative. We've seen that in Ireland and also Italy and the Netherlands, where Parliament is quite involved, or at least has a dedicated kind of accountability discussion day. And then last, and now we come back to the main question of kind of like well-being. Can investments in well-being also improve growth? We do know that, especially with evidence from the more project and individual level that investments in well-being and sustainability will very likely pay off later, but that needs a longer time frame of interest than the annual budget and a few year electoral cycles. So policy objectives such as child poverty reduction, supportive active aging, are fundamental well-being goals in themselves, but they can be instrumental to broader economic and social objectives. For instance, by facilitating labor force participation, the tax base, productivity, strengthening social cohesion. But then this requires accounting for the avoided costs generated by preventative action and second-order spillover effects of public investment, and that's very rarely done at this point. We do have one interesting example by the Australian state of Victoria's early intervention investment framework, implemented by the Department of Treasury and Finance. That's also on the CAP website, and happy to answer more questions there. I believe my time is up. Here's a few further resources, and I very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
How wonderful it is when people speak to time and don't reduce my well-being by forcing me to think about whether I'm going to have to intervene and stop them. Now, I'm confident that what has started well will continue well in timekeeping. And next up is Nigel O'Leary. For those who don't know Nigel O'Leary, he is an economist at Swansea University, and he's also part of what is, I think, the best named institute I've ever heard of in British academia, which is Wizard. So, the man from Wizard, over to you, Nigel.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that, Tim. I'm just hoping that the comment that you said, very guarded, about people keeping to time, that wasn't directed specifically at me, but if you've heard me talk before, it probably was. But I promise that I will keep it to time. Okay. The title, Can Increasing Happiness and Improving Wellbeing Create Economic Growth? So I'm going to take a little bit of a license on this. I'm not going to talk explicitly to that title, although I will touch upon those aspects in what I do. I was also asked to put a Wales focus in that. And I could quite glibly say, well, I'm at Swansea University. I'm a part of Wizard, which is the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data. Well, if I talk about research that I'm doing within Wales, doesn't that cover the remit? Well, I'm not going to quite do that. And maybe some of what I'll do that you won't realise the relevance of it probably until we get quite towards the end. But I'll hopefully give you something that you find interesting, and maybe some things that you've not reflected upon and heard before. Now, where I want to start, though, is that as an economist, that when we teach our students, we teach them macroeconomics 101. And the very first thing we do to them is we tell them, the thing that I always do for my students, is tell them, look, we know that GDP-based measures, gross domestic product, it's not a particularly indicative measure of well-being and access to economic resources. And what I want to do, and what I always do, is come back to a famous quote from a speech by who was then the Senator, Robert F. Kennedy, when he was campaigning for the US presidency back in 1968. And this is a well-quoted speech that he gave. And in this speech, at the time, the major focus of what he said was around student protests in the US education system. It was around the Vietnam War. But right at the end of his speech, he also gave a very, very moving critique of GDP-based measures of GDP measures. And what he said was a very moving piece, but at the time, it didn't really have much traction. And this is part of what he said. I won't read it all out, but I'll just start it off. And what he said was GDP does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. As I said, I won't read it all out, but in essence, what he said, that GDP measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And I guess this is a fairly well-known concept within economics and how it's moved over the past 30 or 40 years. But whilst I said I didn't want to talk about the specifics of everything that he said, one thing that was in there that he talked about what GDP also doesn't do is measure the beauty of our poetry. And if it goes back, and if you go back to the title that I gave, what I said I was going to talk about was well-being and culture. And many of the things that Lara put in her talk previously, that we talk about national capital, we talk about economic capital, human capital, and indeed social capital, going back to the work of Putnam. But something that's not measured in that is cultural capital. Something that's not appreciated, I guess, for the moment, that's not received much attention, is the idea of cultural capital. And that's something that I want to pick up within today's talk. Now, more recently, moving on from the speech by Kennedy, we know, and it builds upon what Lara was just saying, that within the EU and OECD more generally, that economic progress and this concept of well-being has assumed increased prominence. And indeed, if we go back to 2009, when Nicolas Sarkozy was then the president of the Commission, what he set up, initiated, was what is called the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. For short, it's often referred to as the Stiglitz Commission. And what the Stiglitz Commission did is it measured or identified the limits of GDP as a measure of economic and social progress, and assessed the feasibility of introducing alternative measures that would serve a more wide-ranging purpose. Now, bringing it back now to Wales, what we have is a landmark piece of legislation. And what this is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, passed in or initiated in 2015. And what this requires is that public bodies in Wales consider the long-term impact of their decisions across, and I'll mention them in a few moments, across 7 key goal areas. Now, this builds upon a sustainable development principle. And that is the idea that what we want to do is meet goals in the present, the current needs, but without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So within this piece of legislation, these are the 7 goals, the 7 pillars that the public bodies are committed to adhering to. So we've got things such as a prosperous Wales, resilient Wales, more equal Wales, a globally responsible Wales. But 2 areas, 2 of the goals I want to concentrate on. Firstly, it's the idea of a healthier Wales. And in the context of the legislation, this talks explicitly not just about maximising physical well-being, but also of maximising the mental well-being of all citizens. So again, this legislation explicitly talks to this idea around well-being that we've just picked up upon. However, there's also a second key pillar that I want to pick up on, and that is a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language. What this means, it's promoting culture, heritage, and the Welsh language. Now, even though, and I'll show later, that there are obvious links between these 2, a healthier Wales with improved mental well-being of its citizens, but also a Wales that promotes culture and heritage. So that's what the legislation within Wales is, and it's around that area that I wanted to base the remainder of this talk, and in particular talk around culture. And in itself, and it goes back as well, I should say, to that idea of culture picked up by Robert Kennedy back in 1968. It's an area that's received very little attention. So the reason I've come at this is, at the heart, I'm an economist, but I'm a regional economist. But it's looking at culture and its regional aspect within well-being studies. Now, to measure well-being, there's a large literature, and we're quite comfortable of what the determinants of well-being or happiness are. A whole host of empirical studies have shown that people who are more educated are happier. People who are in employment are happier quite naturally than those who are unemployed. Married people are happier than other marital states. Healthy individuals are happier from those with a reported illness, either short-term or long-term. And happiness also increases with income. And in particular, it increases with relative income. That is your perceived income relative to your own comparison group. And happiness also changes over the age profile. It's well documented. It's got this U shape. There's that dip between happiness and age in middle age, and then it increases again into later life. However, genetics and personality have also shown to be important determinants. And this last part is now where my real interest for this subject area arose. It's also the physical environment where people live. The economic and social characteristics of the places that they live are also key determinants of happiness, well-being, and mental health. So, with that then, and I said, I'm sorry if this seems like a shameless plug for some of my own research, but what I wanted to very, very briefly do, and I don't want this to anyway appear like an academic research paper, but what I want to do is just give a very, very quick indication of a current piece of work that I'm doing out of Wizard. This is something that's funded by the ESRC in the sort of the scope of people, places, and the public sphere. And this is looking at the impact of culture upon not just well-being, but importantly, upon mental distress. So what we've done is, or what we are doing, is taken 14 waves from Understanding Society from 2009 up to 2023. And within Understanding Society, there's one particular measure of well-being that's often used in the empirical literature. And this is picking up one of the questions in the GHQ survey. And this measures more to do with mental health and mental distress. And so in the Understanding Society, there are questions that ask about life satisfaction, the questions that ask about physical impairments, the questions that ask about mental health as well. So what we've taken is the GHQ response, which is measured on a scale between 0 and 36, and we've inverted it such that what this does measure is distress. So higher levels of mental distress then have a higher figure. So building upon this question, there are also an additional bank of questions in Wave 5 that asks respondents a broad spectrum of their exposure to cultural experience and cultural attributes of the area that they live in. I mean, for example, they're asked whether they visit public libraries or museums or galleries, and even about their participation in cultural events such as arts or culture-based activities. Then we take these 47 questions and we use principal component analysis to reduce them down into two measures of what we will term cultural heritage and living culture. Now, just to give you an idea about what these two concepts are, cultural heritage represents those exogenous and historically transmitted cultural environment that people live in. So, for example, if you go and visit a historical building or a historical park or garden, that would be classed as cultural heritage. However, we also have living culture, which represents those endogenously shaped cultural attitudes. For example, that you could participate in photography or reading, or even going to the theatre, activities like that. So that would be living culture. Now, just to bring this all together, we've got these two measures of cultural capital. And what we do is use a theoretical framework that's known as the culture-based development framework. And what this does, it conceptualizes the aesthetic experience. And we conceptualize it as the balance between cultural heritage and living capital. And we do that, sort of a technical sense, by using what's known as the Shannon Entropy Index. Then, for these three measures of cultural aesthetic experience, the cultural balance, the living capital, and the cultural heritage, we then find the representation of these across the local authority districts of the UK, of which there are 360. 1961. And this is where my interest as a regional economist really, really comes in. And so what we're trying to do here is capture that cultural milieu within these distinct areas of the UK. So what is and we've mentioned the aesthetic experience. Why is it important? Well, the aesthetic experience is things such as listening to music or dancing or engaging with the visual arts. And this is known from psychological research to be a strong contributor towards individual well-being. However, it's not just psychological research where this evidence emerges, but also neuroscientific evidence reinforces this finding. Engaging in activities such as music and dance, they stimulate in particular the dopamine pathways of the brain, that brain reward system, those areas that are associated with pleasure, motivation, and emotional vitality. So what we've got here then is this idea that this aesthetic experience, that engagement with dance, culture, singing, that these can all have impacts upon well-being. Well, what we've got here, and I've just cut this down very, very simply. What we've got here, that variable here, I won't go through the econometrics of it. It's not really worthwhile for the story. What we've got here is the impact upon that aesthetic experience and what our main dependent variable is, and that is mental distress. So what we have is a strongly negative impact here. That is that as the aesthetic experience within the area, measuring that cultural milieu, as that increases, mental distress decreases. Very, very strong finding. Now, as a small thing within this equation, as economists, empirical economists, what we like to do is throw a whole host of other controls at these. So all of these things that we know do also influence well-being. And what we've got here is the reverse of well-being distress. These are all in these sorts of equations as well. But here, that's a very, very strong finding that comes through. And it doesn't really matter how we cut the cake. So what does this mean? What do I want to take from this? Well, we might say that, well, the aesthetic experience, surely this is just a luxury good. This is just something for certain periods, certain parts of the population. But what we found, what we would posit, is the idea that the aesthetic experience, that exposure to culture, isn't just a luxury good, but rather it's a form of local mental health infrastructure. It's a way of supporting the mental health of the population. And even though, and this will be my last point that I'll mention, even though I didn't give you all the results, what we also find in our results is this interesting distinction between younger and older people. And by younger and older, we just take that EU definition where we've got that cutoff at 40 years of age. And what we find for younger people, and it's certainly within the UK, what's nuts about young people is that's been the group that has faced more recently that largest increase in mental distress. So what we find for these people is that they gravitate towards cultural heritage rather than that sort of balance between cultural heritage and living capital. And whilst this preference provides immediate relief, immediate short-term relief, it's easier to go to those things that you've grown up with. But what this risks doing, though, is entrenching cultural insularity and reducing the long-term adaptive capacity of individuals with population that only come with that endogenously enriched exposure to living capital as well. So hopefully you found that interesting. Hopefully for Tim and Steve, it sort of fits the remit of what I was asked to do. And hopefully you'll give me a little bit of academic license to do that. But I'll be very, very willing and happy to answer any questions in the question and answers later. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Nigel. I particularly liked, if I read the regression analysis correctly, you're finding that participating in dance and the like is 30 times as effective in reducing mental distress as being a monk. I leave it to the listener to decide, on the basis of their own experience, whether that seems plausible or not. We're now going to head north, quite a long way north, up to Scotland, where I'm delighted to say we have the chief economist from the Scottish Government, who has a particular interest in this area, to speak to us next. Gary, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim, and thank you everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak. I've got some slides which I will share also, if I can. And what I want to talk about, I'll just put these on full screen. Yep, that should work okay. Can you see them okay? Okay, so what I want to cover on this presentation, say something about how wellbeing operates within a government framework. I should also note that we're in a pre-election period, so I'll speak more generally about the policies rather than the specifics of any particular government. I'll say something about growth and productivity and maybe why we're having this discussion about happiness, wellbeing and growth. I'll provide an overview of recent approaches in Scotland and how that's framed the interactions of the government and what that implies for how we should maybe think about the economy. So getting back to this question about causation, is growth first and then enhances well-being and happiness. And I'll give one example of a policy in Scotland, Fair Work, which maybe gets into some of these issues in that regard. So that's the plan for the presentation. And I will start now with something around growth. Just let me see if this has moved on. Sorry, I'm only seeing my slides, so please interrupt me if anything goes wrong. So hopefully you're seeing a slide with Scotland and UK GDP growth along the top. And the reason for what the slide shows essentially is the average mean rate of growth for Scotland and the UK over the period to 2024, average growth of 1.6%. And what you see is we see basically confidence intervals, 95% intervals above and below. And you think about these as a kind of system for GDP. And when you have a shock out with that system, it's abnormal. So when you look at that line, what you can see is obviously the impact of the financial crisis, 2007-8, growth fallen out with the system, and then being relatively muted after that. If you carry on along, we see the impact in Scotland, particularly of the oil price falls around 2015. Then you come along to the pandemic shock, which is both quite abnormal in terms of the depth and the speed of the bounce back as well. So this is the context, I think, for why we're having a discussion about growth and well-being. And the context for that, in a sense, is we've been in a period of muted growth given these types of external shocks. If you go right to the end of the chart at the moment, you can see kind of growth in the UK, Scotland. Growth in Scotland last year was 1.4%, broadly similar to the UK, but relatively muted. And then there's a wider story about productivity. And productivity, in particular since the financial crisis, has really dropped. And productivity is important because that's linked to real wages and growth. So all of these factors put a greater spotlight on growth and the relationship between growth and well-being. And if you also think about periods where you do have a dip, a recession, what generally happens, the financial crisis, unemployment increases, that has detrimental effects to people's well-being, financial security, resilience, uncertainty. And in the current climate, the cost of living type shocks from the Ukraine war are similar in that regard. So you get these types of shocks, which basically materially impact people in terms of their well-being and related capacity. So let me just move these on again, if I can. Sorry, I'm having problems with the slides. I'll maybe just carry on without the slides, so I can see the audience. That's maybe better. So I was speaking about GDP growth there, obviously, and what I wanted to do is talk about the recent approaches to growth in Scotland, if you like. Since devolution, all of the economic strategies have all had growth as part of that. But over that period, they became much more socio-economic in nature. So if I think about the 2015 economic strategy, explicitly had two pillars, one around addressing competitiveness, so that was a central pillar, as you would expect in most growth strategies, and the other around reducing inequality. And this came back from a lot of the work done post-financial crisis in terms of the OECD, the IMF, about the period of growth we had from the late 90s through the financial crisis, where during that period, despite constant growth, low inflation, we've seen rises in inequality, we've seen kind of less resilient communities, and the evidence was suggesting that even if you were interested only in growth in the macro environment, trying to reduce these inequalities was much more positive. So alongside that, we also have a national performance framework, which is similar to what Lara's described in the context of frameworks for governments. And I'll say a little bit more about that and how that essentially operates. And then we've talked about kind of how you integrate wellbeing into an economy. So this notion of the economy of wellbeing or wellbeing economy. And the final strategy of that period, the National Strategy for Economic Transformation, is really about, which was published in 2022, is really about addressing the impact of a decade of change, given climate change targets for 2030, child poverty targets, how you bring the operations of government together to address that. Now, I'm sorry I don't have the slide of our national performance framework, but I'll just give a description of it and some background. It wasn't on Lara's slides. It's a subnational strategy. It was first produced actually in 2007, and it came in from what was called a kind of Virginia model, came from Virginia in the States, and it was really about a way of operating or operationalising how government operated. It's since been set in statute as part of the Community Empowerment Act 2015. So it's a legislative framing now, and it has to be updated every 5 years in a consultative process. So what is it? So basically, it's a framework with 11 outcomes. Think of a flower with petals around it. And in the middle of that flower, there's a purpose. And the purpose is set and informed by consultation. And that purpose was really about creating a more successful country with opportunities for all of Scotland to flourish through increased wellbeing and sustainability and inclusive economic growth. So growth was very much at the heart of it, but 11 outcomes straddling environment, justice, connectivity, very similar to the types of issues that Lara highlighted in her programme. And the way I think about this essentially is that these frameworks provide a way to break down silos in government. That's how our former ministers would describe it. And governments can put their priorities on the top of them, but ultimately it draws a kind of connectivity to, requires a connectivity to deliver. They're multi-dimensional, and the way they operate, you report progress. Now, the current version is out for consultation, and the incoming government will decide on how they shape that going forward. But it's very much think about it as an operating framework for government. We don't have departments in Scottish Government, and it's very much a kind of DG-led model to encourage the join up across particular areas of the economy. So what does this mean? So when you think about the economy and the discussion we're having, I've got a great picture which I can't show you, but I'll circulate the slides about taking a kind of broader view of the economy. And the broader view of the economy puts households, communities in the centre. And in the outer ring, you have essentially the globally traded economy. So most growth GDP strategies would look at things like life sciences, advanced manufacturing, tech, digital, financial services, the types of things where you would trade, where you get your source of competitiveness. If you go in a level, then we talk about the foundational economy, the types of things that essentially you need for everyday life: public services, retail, housing, health services. And actually, these are really important, tend not to be tradable. And below that, you've got communities and you've got households. So that kind of taking a broader view makes you think about essentially, even if you're only focusing on growth, many of the constraints for economic growth will be socioeconomic or environmental. So actually, some of the enablers that you need could be housing, could be skills, could be other kind of non-economic policies in order to get that growth. So taking a broader view of the economy is really important. And within that, we similarly have a kind of four capitals approach. And Nigel touched on that. So did Lara. I think New Zealand have a similar approach, maybe with cultural capital as well. But we've got kind of economic, social, labour, human capital, and natural capital within that. And it kind of forces a different approach and join up to those sectors. I mean, if you think also about the role of, say, the NHS, one of the biggest employers in Scotland, 180,000 employees, it's an anchor institution within communities. How they spend, how they link to communities, how they procure can also drive improvements in the community. So very much, we've shifted very much to a kind of place-based type approach. Now, I'm going to just finish up with, I just want to give one example of a policy. We introduced a fair work policy in 2015 with a 10-year strategy for Scotland to become a fair work nation. And this was set up based on academic work from the University of Strathclyde. And it was really, and there's an independent report, there's a Fair Work Convention. And essentially what it was doing was recognising the link between how you're treated in the workplace, the quality of jobs, and actually the productivity of the workplace, and how that kind of feeds through. So improving conditions for workers also improves workplace productivity. And what the report essentially looks at is 5 dimensions: opportunity, respect, effective voice, security, and fulfilment. And actually ranks how Scotland has progressed over those periods. And most of it is relatively positive on opportunity, employment, disability employment gap has reduced, gender pay gap has reduced. So thinking about how you help people into the labour market. Respect, dignity, we know that's important for people's mental health, how you're treated, the flexibility you have within your work, and this notion of security and fulfilment, how you're satisfied within your job. So I think Fair Work's an interesting policy that essentially has broader outcomes, including supporting kind of competitiveness, but also individual and kind of personal well-being. I think you could also touch on, I think Lara touched on some other labour market policies, but you could, if you look at the Mayfield Review, Getting Britain Working, it's about economic inactivity, supporting people on long-term sick back into employment. That's obviously better for the individual, but better for the economy, better for the labour market. So you get this kind of virtuous cycle. But let me finish up, given that I haven't had my slides to talk to. So I think the context, I think Lara kind of showed the use of performance frameworks around 2/3 of OECD countries. So for me, the frameworks are almost like an operating framework for government that encourages a much more joined up, multidimensional, less siloed approach. I think from an economic perspective, then it forces you to take a broader view of the economy and how the economy kind of interacts and impacts on people's lives. The kind of question that at the outset for this discussion around growth, happiness, and well-being, and the links, for me, I think they're all the one thing. And I think if you go back to Adam Smith, whether The Wealth of Nations or Theory of Moral Sentiments, there's some interesting lines. And one I kind of quite like is he talks about government should be viewed in direct proportion to the extent in which they improve the happiness, well-being of their citizens. And this kind of link was very much of the time political economy, where you had economic progress linked to social progress. And I think, in a sense, we're back in that space now. We're really talking about political economy rather than growth per se. We're talking about kind of all boats rising and dealing with the challenges that we face. And it's worth noting that the UN have also got a Beyond GDP programme at the moment, looking to encourage this kind of broader use of well-being. So what I would say is that essentially they are interlinked. I think it doesn't, and I think it's important to pay attention to the different drivers and levers, but the economy and growth remain central to achieving these. And I think really for the resilience of the economy, the economy has to be absolutely central to that. And the final thing I'll say, just give a plug for, Scottish Government introduced a policy, passed the Parliament in February. Community wealth building had a unanimous support, very much a place-based policy, specifically about addressing wealth inequality within areas, and puts a duty on the public sector and others to be aware of that, to use procurement and other drivers to allow community ownership of assets, and actually to kind of think about how we can drive community cohesion, community wealth building. And the model, actually, if you're interested, came to the UK, came to Preston, and actually originally came from Clevedon in the US. So apologies for the slides, but I will stop there, Tim, and happy to pick up any questions. Thanks.
Thank you. And so we move on to our fourth speaker, who I am particularly delighted to welcome. And indeed, when I was asked to chair this event, Sabina is actually the reason I accepted. I'm not sure we've ever met, but I followed her work now for more than 20 years, ever since she co-authored an excellent, if now somewhat dated book, What Can One Person Do?, with a man called Edmund Newell, who was my first ever supervisor when I was an undergraduate. Sabina is a very rare thing. She is in fact, I think she's unique in this. She's an Anglican minister who has a PhD in economics. And that's a Venn diagram with a very, very narrow overlap. And certainly before Sabina, Edmund Newell, her co-author, was the only person who was in that intersection. And so I'm confident that she is now one half of that intersection. So it's an absolute delight to welcome her to this event. And Sabina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And it's really been a joy to hear the different presentations that have come through. And I think we'll change gears a little bit as we move to Bhutan, which is a small, landlocked, developing country of less than 1 million people. But what I'd like to do is briefly introduce the patterns of gross and the conceptions behind their gross national happiness, or GNH index, and some trajectories of economic growth and poverty reduction, and then dive further into the GNH index, unpack it, sort of touching on some issues raised by Nigel and Lara and Gary, and then close with some reflections of how GNH and growth might relate in that context. But I'm aware it is a very different context. You might remember that in 1979, Amartya Sen gave the Tanner Lectures in Human Values when he argued that equality should be measured not in the space of resources, nor of utility, nor of Rawlsian primary goods, but in the space of capabilities. What you may not remember is in that same year, His Majesty the fourth King of Bhutan argued that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. And the year after that, Tyler Marshall interviewed him, and the LA Times observed these quotes that the king said, "We'll modernize, but at a pace Bhutanese people can keep up with." Gross national happiness is just as important, not more important, but just as important as gross national product. And again, looping back to culture and values, he wanted to learn from the mistakes of others and avoided break from the past that was harmful to the generation that experienced that break. Also, others have mentioned the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission, and they articulated 8 dimensions of quality of life. They did not come up with a single headline, but they recognized that one thing that has made GDP a success has been that the powerful attraction of a single headline figure that allows comparisons of socioeconomic performance. And in that same year period, in 2008, the first GNH index was launched. Recall, this is nearly 30 years after the idea of GNH came out, but they felt it was at a time in which measurement was required as the country modernized. And the official GNH index, disaggregable to the Dzongkhag or district level, was launched 2 years later. So what are the contents? Interesting for Nigel, it includes cultural diversity and resilience, which was not present in the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission proposed dimensions, as well as time use. The content, however, of each of the dimensions is also slightly different, and I'll loop back to that. This, of course, as Gary mentioned, has a new resonance with the Beyond GDP high-level expert panel, chaired by Nora Lustig and Kaushik Basu, which is poised to release their report and recommendation, after which this will merge to an intergovernmental process to think about measures beyond GDP. So what I will share is the work of the Royal Government of Bhutan, and it's shared with permission, and it's led by Dashkarma Ura. So in terms of the measurement, initially with many consultations, both across government and the citizenry, 9 domains of well-being were selected. And then a number of indicators were also selected after extensive pilot testing and further consultations. Each indicator obtains a sufficiency threshold, enabling us mathematically to dichotomize ordinal and categorized ordinal categorical data into 0 ones that we can then create cardinal measures from. And each person, this follows the counting-based approach both of Europe and of Latin America, each person then has a profile of the indicators in which she has sufficiency or lacks sufficiency. The indicators are weighted, and each person then obtains a score of the percentage of domains, the domains being the 9 equally weighted dimensions, or weighted indicators in which they enjoy sufficiency. The government doesn't think that everybody needs to be good at everything. So they set a flourishing cutoff that if you have two-thirds or more of a sufficiency score, then you have the causes and conditions of happiness. The rest is up to you. But the government, in policy terms, has done what it must do. And then, of course, the government analyzes the people who are not yet happy, as they term them, and where they need to invest to improve their well-being. And the GNH index is both disaggregated across groups and broken down by indicator. And this enables it to address 3 prominent challenges of composite well-being measures that go beyond dashboards. One being that they often use country averages, which would obscure inequalities within a particular dimension. The second is that composites assume that more is always better of every single indicator, an implicit kind of perfectionism, whereas the capability approach or Bhutan's approach permits pluralism. People can opt out and still flourish. And the emphasis, of course, was creating a policy tool. And so having disaggregated information, which sometimes is difficult for certain composite measures, and having a direct line of sight in a linear format between a change in the indicator and the index improving. And these contrasts with composites and dashboards are documented in a paper for the Development Policy Committee. So the 9 domains include health, education, and living standard, but also governance, environment, time use, and then community, psychological well-being, and culture. And here's an example of a person, and the colored domains are the indicators in which she has sufficiency. Her score is 84%, so she would be qualified as happy by the GNH index. If you would like the mathematical formula of the GNH index, it's basically 1 minus a poverty gap mathematically, but it is also equal to the percentage of people who are happy. They don't have sufficiency in everything, but they have a critical mass. And then for everybody who's not yet happy, they get credit for the indicators in which they have achieved sufficiency. And the GNH index sums these up with a very simple formula, but a rigorous axiomatic one with its properties fully specified. So in 2022, 48.1% of the population were identified as happy. And you can look at growth in GNH as well as growth in monetary terms, and it has grown steadily since 2010. We don't know if it's fast or slow because you can't compare it with other countries. What does this have to do just at this very national gross level with monetary poverty? So these are the annual growth rates in Bhutan from 2010, where it was 11.93%, to 2025, where the projected is that it is 6.5%. So it's not, as Gary said, decisively muted. There was clearly a crash in the pandemic when tourism stopped, and there was a flux of outmigration, but it has picked up. So I haven't done econometrics, we haven't done an analysis, but you can see, broadly speaking, that it does not seem that growth in GNH at least comes at a significant cost to growth in economic terms. The very highest periods were those when there was a very strong performance of the hydropower sector, which is what drives their economic growth, sold to India, so quite a stable market. I should say, looking at the bottom of the distribution, Bhutan also has a multidimensional poverty index, and it also fell consistently. For example, it was over 20% in 2020, and it fell to 2% in 2022. In absolute terms, a very significant reduction, and the poorest donkogs or districts had the fastest reduction. So the growth of well-being in this particular country has not come at the cost of the improvement of poverty reduction among the poorest, including the poorest of the poor. However, Bhutan doesn't want to have one well-being cutoff. It applies 3 to create a social gradient of people who are unhappy because they have less than half, narrowly happy, half to 2/3, extensively 2/3 to 77%, and above that. This just enables them to look at different sectors of their society. And of course, it can be disaggregated. So you can look at the donkogs, which are the districts in their map, with the darkest being those with the highest GNH level. And you can also look at the number of people who enjoy flourishing in each of those districts, which accounts for population, which varies greatly. It might be interesting to overlay poverty, again, coming back to the cultural point Nigel raised. Samtsi at the bottom left is one of those with the lowest GNH and one of those with the highest poverty. But Gaza in the upper center also has the highest poverty, but it also has among the highest GNH. It's a deeply rural indigenous place, no secondary schools or hospitals, still an 8-day walk to Lunana, but strong culture, strong community, harmony with the environment, spirituality, and psychological well-being. So having a well-being as well as a poverty measure enables one to profile the assets of impoverished communities in other domains of their life. And this is the case not only in one period, but as we look across time. Speaking of looking across time, it is quite interesting to use the GNH index as we reflect on growth. So if we look at the period that included the pandemic, 2015 to 2022, the survey being delayed due to the pandemic, we see strong growth in the living standard dimension. Assets, household per capita income, and housing all improved statistically significantly at 99% and 31 percentage points in the case of housing. The other strong improvement was actually in services of water, of sanitation, of electricity, led by government, as well as of schooling for children, literacy for adults, and positive emotions. Many Bhutanese during the pandemic decided to do the Nyundro, or the preliminary practices, and some spiritual activities, which might be beyond the rest of us. However, there was also a decrement. Although there was an overall growth in GNH, you could see what did not go well. There was dissatisfaction with the plan to vote in the next election. All of the cultural indicators declined statistically significantly, as did the number of healthy days during the pandemic, and mild declines in the other psychological well-being indices. So that is, again, a negative. Work and sleep also were not well catered for. So one can then have a conversation about how well-being is evolving across different domains and sectors of the society. And also, as I mentioned, see what still is going well. This, I've only given you a snapshot at the national level. I won't go into the gory details, but men are happier than females, and they have been every period that they've been measured, primarily because of their historical advantage in education, as well as in some of the living standard indicators. If you look at the quintiles by income, in the happiest quintile in 2022, still 41% of the richest people were not happy. And in the poorest quintile, 29.2% were happy. So there is a relationship between monetary poverty, but it is imperfect. And actually, it's also imperfect if you look at life satisfaction, the control ladder, the other subjective indicators. So for policy action, what the government looks at is this. It looks at the percentage of people who are not yet happy and have insufficiency in these indicators. So it knows where to invest and how that will impact the G&H index going forward. And so the advantage of the G&H index, thinking more broadly, is that it does use the change in G&H to capture the headlines. It uses disaggregations to show off the places that had the biggest increase in well-being, and then the indicator composition to plan the policy strategies. And this also creates a society-wide and also government-wide conversation about across sectors which are progressing and which need extra shoring up. So there is not a direct relationship to growth in the studies that I have done. It clearly includes living standard indicators, which are some sense outcomes that would have a direct elasticity to growth. For example, household per capita income. It also includes human capital, which is a clear determinant of the speed and the equity of growth. And it also includes some aspects that came up, for example, in the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission, like harmony with the environment, which includes recycling practices, but also whether the elephants and deer and boar eat your crops, also the extent of responsibility you feel for the environment, and then political governance. So Bhutan has had periods of very high growth, but it may be that the G&H index also shores up intrinsic motivation, which might be important going forward and for productivity. Clearly, the growth fell sharply at the pandemic. There was outmigration. The government rebalanced, made growth an explicit priority. But there also may be gains in investing in the well-being community and culture, as Gary said, to have a more effective political economy overall. So I am at time. I will stop there. I will not go through the policy applications, and I will simply say, Tashi Dele, thank you so much for this opportunity.
And thank you, proving yet again that women are better at speaking to time than men. We had 2 speakers who spoke to time and 2 who did not. And I leave the men to reflect on that for next time. Happiness for a chair is a speaker who does stick to time. So is well-being. Right. The audience have typed some questions in the Q&A. Can I ask the speakers whether they can see the questions in the Q&A? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can? Yes, good. I thought you could. I'm going to kick off with one question, but I'd like to ask the speakers, actually, because I think the quality of questions is really determined by the quality of answer you can give. What I don't want to do is ask a question to which people don't actually have a good answer. So I want to ask the speakers to pick a question of their choice in a moment. But I'm going to ask Sabina one to kick off, which is, Bhutan is very different to Britain or most developed countries. What is the one lesson that you've learned from Bhutan that you think can easily translate to a country such as the UK or to Wales or to Scotland, given that you've got good representatives of those 3 places on the line, or for that matter, to any other OECD country?
Yes, no, thank you so much. I think that it is the methodology. The indicators have to change. The dimensions are okay, could be improved. We had a workshop in February in the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences with representatives, for example, and papers on Japan from the person in the cabinet who had done the well-being indicators in Japan, with data from the US, as well as many developing countries and Argentina and others, which applied this methodology as an academic exercise to different data sets to see the value added and to see the challenges. There was also a study using the Gallup World Poll data. So I think exploring the methodology could be useful, but the indicators need complete readjustment to different contexts.
If you had a link, by the way, to that pontifical or the papers from that, if you had a chance to pop that in the chat, then I think there are some people, if you can find it very easily, I think there are some people who would greatly appreciate that link. Right, I'm now going to go in the order in which the speakers spoke originally. So, Lara, you get the first choice of question, right? It's like a quiz show. Which question do you want to speak to?
Great. I think most of them are actually for the other panelists. There was one
Yeah,
for
you're allowed
me.
to pass.
Yeah, maybe I'll pass. There was one for me that I answered already, but I can repeat it for everyone. It was from Nialish Khan, who was wondering why there's no developing countries in the OECD country list, and whether something like the Better Life Index can be employed to study quality of life impacts for developing countries. So I actually, responded to say that absolutely what I said was only for OECD countries, just for multiple reasons. Our program of work is focusing on member countries, also because the kind of the indicators that we're working with countries on harmonizing are the availability of data is often very different, just also for those technical reasons. That being said, absolutely, a well-being agenda is very relevant globally. Sabina already mentioned it is being picked up by the UN right now. There's a high-level expert group beyond GDP. I've posted the link and under the answered questions in the Q&A that people can check out, and even the dimensions that have been put out. It's not the final ones. There's kind of been a proposed dimensions list that's been published and that's out for consultation right now. It does look very similar to what kind of always happens when you ask people what matters to them in a good life. So I don't expect a lot of big surprises there, but we'll see what the actual indicators will look like to be applicable at a global level.
Right. Nigel, you're up next.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think, what I'll do first of all, it's not a question that was asked, but I will answer one of the questions later. But Tim, so I'm using this opportunity to say two things as opposed to one. So pushing the boundaries yet again. So I know I'm not going to get another invite back. So the question that you raised about the results table that I put on there, and that link between that balance and the presence of monks. Actually, I didn't want to go into the econometrics of it, but what that table showed, actually, there were two sets of results there. It was a two-stage least squares. And so that first column that you saw, those were the instruments in there. So we're looking at those exogenous instruments to correct for the endogeneity of that entropy index. So actually, they weren't directly comparable. But the reason I want to answer that as well is what I should have said, because I was mindful that time was going on, and I didn't mention my co-authors on that piece of research as well. And that's with Annie Tubaji, who's probably one of the most eminent cultural economists here in the UK, and also Yashi Jain as well. In terms of the questions in the Q&A, this is almost as if I was in an academic seminar, and it's that first question that was raised by Woody. And the question was, do people with creative, active participation in their culture differ in well-being from those with reflective, more passive pursuits? I guess my response to that's a really, really interesting question. It's not one for which I've got an answer for. And the way that we construct this data is that there are different types of activities, some things that people engage in actively. One of the questions, for example, is do you engage in a sports activities, for example, darts? Well, it's pretty difficult to think how that might be a purely cultural activity. But when we do the principal component, it is possible to unpick the weightings of these in the variance. So that's something that could be revisited. And indeed, I think it probably is something that is worthwhile revisiting. And thank you, Woody, for that suggestion. It is something worthwhile revisiting in the way that we create these living culture and cultural heritage measures, just to see if there is a distinction there that could be teased out and adds further insight. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Gary, we come to you. And Sabina, I will give you a chance to ask your preferred question as well as the one I set you earlier. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and apologies for the problems with the tech. I'm happy to share my slides. Apologies for that. So I was going to pick up one of the questions, I think, in relation to the elections in Scotland and Wales that's asked about whether wellbeing was central. I think the terminology of wellbeing has been central, but actually the factors that drive wellbeing have. So if you think about the cost of living, it's been a major issue. The NHS, its performance, housing, all of these issues absolutely central to people's kind of well-being, but maybe not put together within that framing. So so I think, yeah, so I suppose the answer to the question is they're there, but maybe not as explicit as what we should have said. I should have also mentioned just one other thing in passing. Scotland's part of a group called Wellbeing Economy Governments, which was created in 2018. Wales are part of that, has New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, and Canada participates. And the group's really about sharing policy and practice within this space and evidence, supported by the OECD and others. And we meet and do that activity. And we've had engagement with Bhutan as well in the work that Sabina has described as well. But what I would say about well-being in a sense is, the reason I make this point was kind of prompted by Sabina, is it can be quite specific to different countries. Different countries can have particular issues, maybe it's Indigenous communities or mental health or whatever particular issues. But these broad frameworks allow governments to set priorities and then have a multidimensional kind of assessment of how they're doing that. Another thing I would say is, despite the differences, the commonalities in approach are really strong, because everyone's dealing with similar problems at the moment across kind of mental health, climate, social justice, etc. But anyway, I will stop there to let other questions come in.
Thank you. Sabina.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate all the questions. There are quite a few, but if I pick one, I guess there was a question about what is the response from citizens and people about this work and how it reflects how they feel and the actions taken from it. So in Bhutan, there's been formal focus groups with different people in remote or rural areas and urban areas to identify whether they understand and agree with the GNH. There have been revisits to people who were the happiest to learn what went right in their lives, and revisits 5 years after to see how that has changed, just at an interest level. But I think that there's a widespread recognition that it's time to revise the index, and it is being revised. So the next one will continue this series, and then it'll have a new series, and that's requested from the top, and it's also coming up from the bottom. Our hope is that the Beyond Lab in Geneva will co-work with Bhutanese youth, and they'll do an app where the Beyond Lab might do international variables, the Bhutanese might do national ones, but people can fill out their questions and then get in real time their sufficiency score, and then reflect on it and say, is it accurate, is it inaccurate, and how? And that might be one way of both testing a different mechanism of data collection and also of getting input from the digitally competent generation or interested generation. There are lots more questions which I'd love to answer, but that's my one.
Thank you. Now, last week I went on holiday. I went to Italy and it was lovely. It was actually a belated summer holiday for various reasons that I won't go into. But I find it easy to tell a narrative about economic growth. If we're richer, we can go on holiday more often. And I can promise you the ice cream in Italy is excellent. But as Audrey McDougall points out, we're in a world where telling narratives is much more powerful than telling statistics. Even I misunderstood Nigel's 2 lines of regression coefficients, and heck, if even a chair at a faculty of the Academy of Social Sciences doesn't understand the regression results, there really isn't much hope for all of us who are proper social scientists. But well-being seems to me to be a good area where we can tell good narrative stories. So I want to invite any or all of the participants, you can put your hand up, to give me a good example of when there's been a good narrative that they think hasn't just told a story, but has changed the understanding of the debate in a way that has been really helpful to the agenda they're putting forward today. So do any of our 4 panelists want to raise their little finger? Hooray, Sabina, thank you.
I mean, so many stories because we do lots of field work.
Mm.
So two very, very brief ones. One is a man who is illiterate, didn't have a good house, so quite a simple farmer that you might think would be poor, did very well on the G&H index. And when he was asked what made him feel, good in life, he loved to listen to his potatoes grow. And sort of the shackles of one mind are open because in the domain of living standards, he bottomed out. He was insufficient. But in other areas, it was very competent. Another person who was poor by the National Multidimensional Poverty Index, PUBA, 72 years old, again, disabled husband, raising her granddaughter who was out of school because she had to take the animals to graze, lots of problems, but offered us an egg for lunch, so the generosity, and was deeply respected in her community as a village elder and as a wise woman. So I think bringing these and focusing them opens up both the tragedies and the joys in different ways. And I think that's been really a learning experience.
Does anyone else want to? Yes, there we are. Gary, the view from Scotland. And then Lara.
Yeah, maybe come in a couple of comments. I think on narrative, what's interesting with our national performance framework, which was previously consulted on, they asked participants what type of country you wanted and how you wanted to be treated. And people talked about kindness, dignity, and a society that respects the rule of law. So you can kind of tell a narrative about what people want in that. There's some really good examples in Scotland of different policies, mostly like Sabina described at the ground level, whether it's active communities taking over derelict land, ownership of energy, offshore wind being used again for the community, community activity supporting outcomes locally, and then kind of being adopted or developed elsewhere. I think probably if I go back to the national performance framework, we'll probably if you think about links and policies, child obesity, physical activity, where you can tell us a story about how a policy, a non-health policy, actually has more of an impact and is better for people's well-being in that regard. And I think another narrative that's probably quite central to this is in the UK and Scotland. Recently, we've seen data about healthy life expectancy falling. So the years of life where you can, and I think that's a big issue, particularly when it's fallen below 60 and we're expecting people to work to 67. So that maybe pushes the narrative to think about your life over that period, think about prevention, more holistic health, work, community, and the factors that drive kind of healthy outcomes and activity. So I would think the narratives are really, really important.
Thank you. Lara.
Great. So I'll get back to happiness and life satisfaction after all. When we do our country rankings on life satisfaction, Latin American countries tend to have relatively high scores on that compared to other OECD countries. And there used to be, certainly a few years ago, always this argument like, well, why? Like all the things that, predict high life satisfaction, income, economic conditions, they are lower. What's their conversion secret here? And it is, one argument that we are increasingly also seeing play out in data is just because all the other things that make a good life, personal relationships, tend to be higher valued and higher lived out there. This is just a plea for, the multidimensionality of well-being. And I think everyone, who is imagined to be on their deathbed would also probably imagine what they would say about what has made a good life and what relationships meant for that.
Although I promise you, the ice cream is going to be on my deathbed speech.
Yes, I hope so.
Now, I want to build on Lara's comment there by taking a question from Valerie, who talks about unpaid care work. And one of the happiest people I know is a man called Ed Davey, who's will be known to most of you as the leader of the Lib Dems, but he's been a friend of mine for 30 years. He lives around the corner. I'm his constituent. And I've seen he's now talked more openly about his son, who's very disabled. And it takes a lot of work to look after a disabled young man. John is now, I think, 18 for all of those years. And it's not always fun work. It's hard work. It can be physically hard work. John is big enough that, you can't just pick him up and put him to bed. You have to coax him and cajole him and whatever. But I've seen that sense of quality of life satisfaction for Ed and for Emily, which Ed's talked about in his book on care and why it matters to him. For those of you who don't know his story, he was orphaned as a child, brought up by his grandparents. His grandfather then died when he was 18. He spent almost all of his life in some sort of caring role for elderly relatives and now younger people. But I wonder for any of you how you think we can best include that sort of unpaid work, which isn't always work in the conventional sense, into our understanding of life satisfaction and separately of happiness. And as one other person said, the difference between those different measures that we often use interchangeably, or at least people like me who are not experts often use interchangeably. So again, put your hand up if you want to answer that. Thank you. Nigel.
Yeah,
Nigel first.
I'll kick this off. And I guess it probably talks to maybe what I would have responded to on the previous question as well. I think it was raised in the Q&A by Linda and Neilish, but also it talks to as well what Gary said in his response to Ed in the Q&A, that it's how do we measure what makes life worthwhile. And I think it probably goes back to that quote that I gave at the beginning of my presentation, that it is very, very subjective. And whilst in the empirical research, a lot of work is look at subjective well-being. Well, subjective well-being in itself can just be a dimension of what well-being is. There will be objective measures. There will be subjective measures. And you certainly mentioned your friendship with Ed and know his story well. But it is taking that step back on what really, really makes a life worthwhile. And I guess it is that subjective element that is important, and it goes back again to this was Gary's response, that it's very difficult for an individual to understand what well-being is. And Sabina mentioned this as well, that everyone understands the money in their pocket, but genuine, and I say it to I'm sorry to bring this back round to economists and students, but I say it to our students as well, that you look at the data out there. There was a report quite a while ago by the IFS, and of all the disciplines you can do outside of medicine and dentistry, the highest paying disciplines are economics graduates. But again, money isn't everything. It's what makes you happy. So, I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, but it moves away from that. It's an individual knows what makes their life happy. Not everyone does.
Can I just say, as someone who taught economic history for 25 years at LSE, and as you may know, not only is economics the highest ranked discipline, taking into account A-level grades, but LSE is the highest ranked institution. I can tell you a lot of that is self-selection. The number of students who would turn up to me on week one and say, how do I get a job in Goldman Sachs? And I say, I don't know. I never applied for a job in Goldman Sachs. It never interested me. Go to the career service. I'm here to help you be a good student. And they'd look really disappointed. So I think we need to be a little bit careful on the causality between the subjects studied and the incomes earned, which is something I used to say to ministers when they were keen on pushing more higher paid subjects. Now, I think somebody else had their hand up, but you change order on my screen every time someone speaks. Oh, we've got Gary and then Sabina.
So I'll come in briefly because I'm off mute. I think the question of the care economy is quite interesting, and it's been one that's came up. In fact, Sabina made a reference it in the kind of beyond GDP work. It's probably likely to be a recommendation for how you kind of capture unpaid work within GDP. But it's an issue because it's an issue and it's a policy issue of relevance. And we've seen policies around supporting carers, particularly younger carers, and recognising that the role that they do. And I think it interacts with public services as well in terms of unmet need. But it talks to a wider point, I think, about social capital, social cohesion, communities, and that kind of sense of purpose and support. So I think it's an important part for wellbeing, and I think if some of the OECD work as well around the determinants of misery. Loneliness is one of those. And I think, although it tends to be older people, it's kind of linked to community and sense of worth and support and purpose, and connections are really important for well-being. So I think it's an important area.
Thank you. Sabina. Sabina or Lara, I can't remember which of you, I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you so much. So the question asked about the time use, and the time use does have originally 15-minute intervals with primary and secondary activities. And so it does include care work, but it is independently analyzed in previous reports. But on care, we are trying to think of how to measure it, because we work on measurement, and it's complicated because there's the carer and the person who receives the care, and the carer may want to take care of my mother or my child. That might give me joy and give me a sense of peace. Or it might be the wrong period of my career. It might be too much for me. I might not do it. The relationships may not be good. And the cared for may really want this daughter, son, family member person to care for them, or they may want something completely different. And so it seems that the direct measures of whether care is occurring or not are not associated with well-being, because it depends on the context. On one hand, if a person has the opportunity to care and make ends meet, even if it's not a high pain, but it is some pain, then that gives them the capability to do so. And that's one sort of policy out. In the questionnaires, we ask in a sense about loneliness, belonging. Do you have somebody you can talk with, not only about financial things, but also about intimate things? And somebody who recognizes who you really are, doesn't just treat you as a body. And those kinds of relational questions put up against the fact that introverts and extroverts will have different relational needs. So the measurement is complex, but not impossible. But I think when it comes to putting those measures into well-being, you have to recognize the different stages of life and types of relationships. So it's a little bit more complex than just an indicator of care or no care.
Can I push that one a bit further, whether it's Sabina or someone else? Another book I read recently, which is also excellent, is Sajid Javid's memoir of growing up as a young Asian man in Britain in the 70s and 80s. And he discusses racism, the racism he experienced, the racism also from his family to people of other ethnicities other than his own. But what I want to ask you about is the tension between well-being that Sabina talks about there, between sometimes the cared and the cared for, if one wants to do it and the other doesn't want to receive it. But more generally, and Saj talks about how he upset his family a lot by refusing an arranged marriage. And the woman concerned, his cousin, was very keen on this. She was distraught because she thought he'd already agreed to it and had been told, and that every time they went for a walk, that this was part of their courtship, which he had no idea he'd been betrothed to her. And when he discovered, he was very angry. But there you've got that tension between well-being for one group. Annie talks about this in terms of cultural diversity. So you can get it within cultures. Sajid is culturally the same, obviously, as his family, but he isn't quite the same. So what do people think are the big tensions in the well-being literature, where one person's well-being may come at the cost of another person's well-being, and what we can do about that? Where should power lie in those circumstances? Any of you are free to raise your hand and answer that question. Or you can all say it's a good area for future research, and that's what the Academy exists for.
I think mainly the latter. The only thing I'd say, again, empirically, the demographic and health surveys carry questions of, are you able to make these major decisions? And they ask if it's the female of the house and the primary male of the house. Usually they are partners. And 41% of the time, their questions disagree. Their answers disagree of whether they can or can't, and the other spouse does. And so it does seem that reciprocity and mutuality are also themselves contested ground. And so I think we need more research and understanding. It's not something I can comment on. I just know the measurement intricacies.
That sounds good. Yeah. Gary, I think you were waving your pen.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that's a challenge a little bit with subjective well-being, where you can get different views at different times. You ask people to rate how they're feeling at a particular point in time. So I think that can be challenged. One way around that is to look at to break down by equalities or family type, to try and get into a bit more of the detail. Because I think the example you give is a good example about the kind of the difficulty of generalising. And I think when we talk about well-being, we would think about kind of societal well-being, more collective well-being. rather than maybe the, strictly speaking, the kind of happiness, subjective well-being, which is obviously important, but thinking about kind of societal and more kind of global well-being, because you'll get these kind of trade-offs in terms of different scoring, different perceptions on the same question, even within the one household.
Thank you. Right, before we close, I'm going to ask everybody on the panel to give one piece of personal advice to all of our listeners. What should they read? I mean, it could be anything from what you should do this afternoon. I'm going to recommend ice cream because it's a very sunny day. There's a theory of bread, as you can see in my life, to something they can do more generally that will increase their own well-being, or something they can do that will lead to an increase in society's well-being, whether that's their immediate society or national society. And that's a very hard question because I didn't tell people I was going to do this in advance. And I'm going to ask you in the order you appear on my screen, which means we're going to go Nigel, Gary, Sabina, and Lara in that order. So Nigel, what is your closing piece of advice to our listeners?
My closing, I think there's an advert I keep on hearing on the radio. It's my closing piece of advice. Always to wear comfortable shoes. I can't remember what it's an advert for, but maybe I think that's a good one to go for. I mean, otherwise, there's a very good book written by Andrew Clark and others, The Origins of Happiness. I think if you want a good overview of this whole literature and on what's going on and developments for the future, a bit of exposure to culture and read that book whilst you've got your comfortable shoes on.
Excellent. There we are. Read a book with comfortable shoes. Gary.
Okay, I think I've always tried to try and get balance in my life between kind of family, work, and kind of physical health. So that's always been something that stuck with me. At this time in my life, I like gardening, I like exercise. I think if you want to do something to support your communities, help people, volunteering is great. And I would say to people to watch out for burnout. I think, and your kind of nervous system is really important, and to think about activities which kind of reduce that, and kind of the concept of maybe try and think about time to decompress.
Sabina.
Thank you so much. I guess it would be a little bit similar, but one of the indices of culture, and that was a question for me, is the number of days you spend in some kind of cultural activities. And that activities of your choice, but something that in a sense enriches your life, stimulates in an artistic way, but isn't necessarily work. And so enjoying that and putting that, building that in does seem to be one of the things that enriches and provides a kind of catalyst.
And finally, Lara.
Great. So I'm also going to stick with this kind of do something for others, and that can take many forms. There's a lot of evidence on how that is good for others, but also for your own well-being. And I think it's actually even more important, especially in the OECD country context, we have aging societies, and there's a question of, what do people do? I see that personally with my father right now, who's retired, right? So I think, and who's just joined a gospel choir, and it's amazing. And so lots of kind of opportunities also as our society shift in terms of demographic composition. And what everyone should check out is I'm going to selfishly plug the OECD Wellbeing Data Monitor, which we launched last November, which has a very, very nice, I think, visualization where you can play with the well-being data and see how your country is performing. I can't post in the chat, but I think it's on my slides at the very last slide.
I think it is indeed. Well, on that note, we are 2 minutes ahead of time because I know that the worst thing you can do as a chair is overrun. That is not a recipe for the happiness of anyone. So to those who have dialed in to listen, thank you very much. To the speakers, thank you for giving up your time. To all of you, please join the mailing lists of the Academy of Social Science. Thank you all once again. And finally, thank you to the organisers, those people behind the scenes sitting there who do all the hard work that allows me to claim the glory of apparently organising this session and sharing it, when in fact I just have to turn up 10 minutes before for a briefing while the wonderful panelists do all the hard work and other people do the hard work behind the scenes. So thank you all.